Good afternoon. My name is Justine Mallinson. I'm the Retrofit Assessor Coordinator for Bruton Town Council and Castle Perry. Bruton Town Council went out on a limb really. They applied for funding and were successful with their bid from the Somerset Climate Emergency Community Fund, and they have employed myself as a retrofit assessor, coordinator, and also I will have a retrofit project manager joining me within the next couple of weeks. So I've been in post for about 2 months. We went live about a month ago, about 4 weeks ago. I mean, really what I want to talk to you about is why do we need retrofit advice for private households? What is retrofit? Because that's the biggest question. There's a very people think retrofit is all about insulation and solar PV, and it is, but it isn't, because that's not all there is to it. And if we do continue just thinking it's about insulation and solar PV, we are not going to meet our net zero targets for 2050. So in Somerset itself, 97% of the dwellings in Somerset are privately owned. So there's only a very, very small proportion of social housing in Somerset. So that's 97% of households that actually really don't know anything about retrofit. A lot of these houses are old, they aren't on the gas grid, they've got solid walls, they're difficult to heat and they're difficult to treat and they're difficult to retrofit. And the market that we've got at the moment is set up for sales. So it doesn't give any impartial advice. If people want advice on what they need to do in their property, they'll ring an air source heat pump provider, or they'll ring somebody with solar PV, and those people will come and try and sell them a system. They won't get any impartial advice, so they don't actually know what needs doing to their property. And as a whole, householders don't have a clue as to where to start with their property, and that's the experience that I get when I go around to people's houses, is they're so glad of actually being given a plan of what they need to do over the next sort of 20 to 30 years, so they can get their little piece of their little castle down to as near to zero carbon as they can. So obviously what I do, it's very holistic. I look at the whole house. I'm not just looking at individual measures. I'm looking at the whole house as a system that people live in and live their own individual lives in. But what I would also say is that if we are ever going to enable large-scale transition to low carbon heating, then we need to make our housing stock suitable, because otherwise we're just going to throw lots and lots of people into severe fuel poverty, because low carbon heating, electric heating, is so much more expensive than gas, and gas prices are going through the roof as it is. So if we don't make those houses suitable, then we're never going to hit that net carbon zero without lots and lots of trauma of people not being able to heat their properties. I've also got a Maslow triangle of hierarchy, but the bottom of mine starts with energy conservation. So that's what we're looking at first. We conserve what energy that we've got. Then we look at energy efficiency, and energy conservation is about shutting curtains, it's about putting draft excluders on your door, it's about doing all of those things that keep you warmer in your house. Then we start to look at energy efficiency, so we can look at your property and we can work out what needs doing in your property, whether that be insulation, air tightness, which everybody else knows as draft proofing, but we call it air tightness because it's a lot more than little sticky things around your windows and doors. Then we look at the energy demand in your property, and once we've got that insulation, that air tightness, the energy demand has been very, very much reduced. And then finally we look at renewable. And the reason we do it in that way is mainly because when we retrofit a property and we're looking at insulation and we're looking at air tightness, we're looking at measures that will last 50 or 60 years. And so if we can get those done first, when we're upgrading boilers, they're lasting 15 years. Solar PV, we're not quite sure how long it's going to last. You know, it hasn't been around a huge amount of time, and obviously technology is changing all the time, but it's very expensive. So if we can get the lower parts of that triangle sorted first, then we can then move on to sort of renewable energy and look at that. So what do I do as a retrofit assessor coordinator? I provide a bespoke, so to your individual house, retrofit assessment and a medium-term retrofit plan for the privately owned market. We provide that for people in Bruton for free. People in Castlecarry have to pay a small fee. We are not charging market rates at this moment in time. Market rates are quite expensive. Everything that I do is produced under the umbrella of PAS 2035 standards, which were brought in earlier this year. They're government-approved standards, and they're under the government trust mark. And they were put together simply because we had an insulation industry and a funding industry that was funding one-off measures, that was doing it badly, that was ripping people off, and that was leaving people with all kinds of issues in their properties. So it was looked at as a holistic way of looking at retrofit, and they put together these PAS 2035 standards. I'm not actually lodging under PAS 2035. PAS 2035 is for government funding, and so what we're looking for is the able to pay market, who seem to have been ignored in the whole of this. We seem to have two sets of standards between social housing and people who are getting funded to help retrofit their properties, and the able to pay market who are just being left on their own. I'm also trying to create a demand for the local supply chain, because all the previous iterations of this type of work have gone, we've got a massive consumer demand, and we've proven it ourselves in Bruton. We've got 15 people on the books. We haven't even really advertised. We've just done a very soft launch, and we've got people contacting me from outside of the parish, saying, is our parish doing this? Can we do this? So the issue, it falls down with the supply chain all the way along. Everyone has failed with supply chain. So what I'm actually doing, as well as producing a medium-term retrofit plans, is talking to local architects, because we do need architects to help design the finer details of this installation. It's not easy. It's quite complex. I'm talking to local builders, I'm talking to building supply merchants, and we've got a building supplies merchant on board who are going to start stocking the insulation products that I'm looking for. And I'll talk a little bit more about insulation products in a minute. But actually the insulation products that are available locally at your Travis Perkins are all oil-based insulation products. They're not breathable, they're not vapor permeable, and they are not suitable for our old houses. They are just going to damage our houses. Plus they have an awful lot of embodied carbon in them. So we have got a local building supply merchants who are going to start stocking, both in Glastonbury and Evercreech, who is our local branch. And they're going to also be providing education and training for their builders. They're going to educate their staff so that they understand about the sort of products that I will suggest that they will use. But also we need to get training. We need our builders, we need our tradespeople to be able to understand what we do in retrofit as well. So we need local colleges to not only be dealing with your Kingspan and your sort of Celotex type insulation products and your gypsum plaster. They need to be able to use products such as wood fibre insulation and lime plaster. They need to understand how to use that, because it's really, really important that we don't damage our housing stock in our rush to get insulated, that we end up being unable to live in the houses that we've actually insulated. So basically, what do I do? What do I do when I go to somebody's house? I do a condition survey, an occupancy assessment, an in-depth energy assessment. So it's kind of like an EPC, but it's like a gold standard EPC in that I'm looking very, very particularly at window types. I'm not making any assumptions about anything. I'm putting everything on my plan. And then I create, when I've done that, I create a retrofit strategy. The strategy itself, it looks at insulation, it looks at air tightness, and air tightness, so as I said, we kind of know it as draft proofing, and it is draft proofing, but it's draft proofing plus. So we look at using membranes. When we're fitting insulation, if we put an air tightness membrane and use air tightness tapes and use grommets above our light fittings in our bedrooms, then we stop those drafts as well. And if we do it at the same time as insulation, it doesn't cost us lots of money. It's not particularly expensive to do, but we have to know to do it at the same time. If we don't know to do it, we're just going to miss it. When we've got insulation and air tightness together, we need to have a ventilation strategy. If we make our houses really warm and we make them so that no drafts blow through them, we're going to be left with condensation, we're going to be left with mould, and so there has to be a ventilation strategy if we are dealing with that. So that is also part of my retrofit plan. We have an overheating strategy, because we know that the climate is going to get warmer. So this is kind of resilience, this is adaptation. We know that we're going to be having hotter summers, and when we insulate properties, it can deal with an average warm summer, but when we get those severe heat waves and heat gets in the house and it's insulated, it can't get out. So we have to put that into the strategy as well. That can be as easy as planting a few trees on your south and west facing elevations, or something to create some shade, or we can put various tints on windows. We can do something, but we have to be thinking about it now so that people can plan for that. I then produce a medium-term retrofit plan. That plan sits on the property ideally for 20 to 30 years. And what it actually means is that there is a phrase, isn't there? Fail to plan, plan to fail. And if we don't plan to retrofit our properties, then we are going to fail, and we are not going to be able to get down to as close to zero carbon as we need to. So in my retrofit plan, there's an estimate of overall costs. There's an estimate of payback period. So if you put this insulation measure in, with the savings on your bill, how long is it till it's paid off? The rate that the energy tariffs are going up, it's going to be really soon. So actually retrofit is becoming massively financially viable. I also look at carbon cost effectiveness, so I will also look at various different measures that I could put in, and I can compare them to each other and say, well, actually, if I put this in, it costs this much, but it only saves this amount of carbon. But if I put this other measure in, this will actually save this much more carbon, and it can give you a strategy. And obviously, I'm looking at bill savings as well. So the condition report is actually a really, really important part of my role. And the condition report basically tells me how the house is built, whether it is vapour open or vapour closed, and that's really, really important because that leads what type of insulation I'm going to recommend to go into the property. Generally, houses built before 1919 are vapour open because of the materials they were built with, because they have lime mortar, because they have stone and brick, and there is movement in and out. Vapour can move through that substrate. That's not to say that we don't change that, because lots of houses have got sort of cement concrete render on the outside and gypsum on the inside. Some of them still function perfectly well like that, but others of them don't, and it comes out with damp. So, you know, some people will have sort of the inside of the house skimmed, and suddenly there's all these damp patches, and that's because there's damp in the wall, and then it pushes the new gypsum off. Also, gypsum and cement are very, very carbon-heavy technologies. So, you know, we also need to be looking at that and taking that on board. I look at ventilation and ventilation pathways. So if we're going to be putting insulation in lofts, if we're going to be putting insulation under suspended floor, then there has to be ventilation through there, because without ventilation we get condensation and mould. So I'm looking for those pathways to ensure that they're in the property before I recommend that we do any kind of insulation work in there. In the same way, there has to be air coming into the property. So especially if we're making it into an airtight box, I have to know that there's trickle vents in the windows. I also need to know that windows open, so if there's overheating, then people can actually literally open their windows to let a through draft. So I'm checking all of those kinds of things. Building defects, glazing defects. I do actually produce a sort of 12 to 15 page condition report. It's equivalent to a level 3 building survey, and it will give that information. So the people, that sits with the medium-term retrofit plan. I'm also doing an occupancy assessment, and really we do the occupancy assessment because every home is different. It has a different number of people living in it. They live different lifestyles. They may have young kids, there may be elderly people, people with chronic illnesses, people that need to be warm. And especially now working from home, because there's so many of us working from home. But what that actually means is, yeah, we're not using carbon in our cars, and we're not driving around in our cars, but we've got our heating on all the time. So, for one person sitting at home. So, you know, that can be important. And also, you know, I'm looking at when they turn their heating on, who their tariffs, you know, have they got high usage items? And I can give them information about the best way to run the heating, the best kind of, you know, I'm looking at light bulbs even, you know, there's so many people still with those 1980s downlighters in, which is so expensive to run. You know, we're looking at all of those kinds of things. I do my energy assessment, and we're looking at all of those things that you can see there. Like I said, it's a gold standard energy assessment, so it's nothing like the energy, sort of like the energy assessment you'll get when you have an EPC done, but it takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours to do this energy assessment. My initial assessment will take about 3.5 hours just in an average property. In a large property it could take up to a day. So I'm really looking at that property in depth. Insulation materials, so I talked about this earlier on, the type of insulation materials, the vapor open ones, the breathable ones, the vapor closed ones, the non-breathable ones. These are really easily accessible at your builders merchants. These aren't. You have to go to your specialist eco green store, green building store. You have to order them in. You have to wait for however lead time to get them. These are the sort of things that we are, I guess I'm allowed to say their name. Well, I'm working with Bradford's, so they are going to start stocking all of these kinds of things, which is brilliant, and they are absolutely behind getting these products into their local stores, which means that builders will see them and will ask about them, and especially if we have a consumer demand for these building products, then they're not going to be putting these building products in, and some of these building products can cause terrible issues with your property if you are not aware of whether your property is vapor open or vapor closed. The other thing about these is they're renewable.
How do you feel about cavity wall filling, or is that bridging the gap for dampness?
It depends on the property, so I wouldn't recommend having a cavity wall insulation done without actually having a boroscope in your cavity to see what is going on. I wouldn't recommend cavity wall insulation for properties that are in very exposed areas. But for your average property, and the cavity wall insulation that they use now will not absorb the moisture and will still allow the moisture to run through. So for your average property, yes. But each property is actually individual. I'm being given a wrap-up to sign, so I feel I should probably got started. Medium-term retrofit plan, so it's a strategy to low carbon over 20 to 30 years. My job is to be risk aware, so my job as a retrofit coordinator is to be aware of the risks, aware of any unintended consequences that might happen. We look at the fabric first, we work through that list. Once we've got all of this in place, we've got a reduced heat demand. We're suitable for low carbon heating, so we can put our air source heat pumps in here because they will work and they won't cost a fortune. At this point, it will be cheaper to have an air source heat pump than to have the gas boilers that we've got at the moment. And then finally, we can stick renewables on the roof. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be done in this order, but ideally, those renewables can then feed into your air source heat pump, produce your own electricity, heat your hot water using a diverter off your solar PV. And so at this point, you're nearly zero carbon, or you're very, very low carbon. So very quickly, trigger points, and this is why we have a medium-term retrofit plan, and this is why it lasts for 20 to 30 years. We live in houses and we do things in houses that mean, you know, we change a kitchen, we change a bathroom. If we've got a retrofit plan, we look at our retrofit plan and go, right, it's time to do our floor insulation because we're taking our kitchen out or we're taking our bathroom out. And if you've got that plan, you're not going to create lots of disruptions for yourself because a lot of these things are quite disruptive. So this is our adage. We build tight, we make sure there's lots of insulation, it's as airtight as we can get it, and we make sure the ventilation strategy is right. We check that there is no thermal bridging, and we use that through using retrofit designers, which are basically architects. Architects who have been trained to look at low carbon techniques. We ensure that all that's in place. And this is what we end up. So we end up with feeding the supply chain, which is really important. It's local. So PAS 2035, so the big government funding stuff, they're all national companies. We're not interested, or Mr. and I have buildings as well. They're not interested in helping the local supply chain. This is about creating jobs locally. Those are the type of jobs that we're looking at. And it's driven by consumer demand, and consumer demand is huge. It's absolutely huge. And hopefully, you know, we can really make this work in Bruton. We can use it as a blueprint. So I am the only retrofit assessor coordinator employed by a town council to help with private households in the UK. So nobody else has done it yet. So, you know, we're really pioneering. But hopefully, this is what we're told, is that the green revolution, don't like those words, but, you know, is going to create jobs. This is how we create jobs, and we do it locally. And we build resilience, and we adapt our houses to climate change. And when I was speaking about overheating, I think at the same point we can adapt to flood resilience. When we're putting a retrofit plan together, if we are in the right area, you know, if that area is prone to flooding and deluge, then we can also write that into the retrofit plan. Okay, thank you.